30 years into democracy, we truly don't deserve to be here. It does feel like South African government, particularly during the Zuma and Ramaphosa periods, divest from education as a priority.
Sure.
Stop corruption. Don't cut budgets.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. Today, I'm extremely excited to be joined by the General Secretary of Equal Education, Noncedo Madubedube. Thank you so much, Noncedo, for joining us.
Great. Thanks for being here. I love a little bit of a spread the fire. I'm about that business.
You know this.
So it's good to be here. Thank you so much for having us.
The pleasure is ours. And you're one of the most important people in activism in the country, in my view. And tell us how you got involved in activism, and in terms of your upbringing, was there any moment where you realized that, you know, you were destined for this activist role?
I think I'm what they call a red baby. So my mom is a trade unionist, member of the youth league, the women's league. I grew up in the Presbyterian church. We're part responsible for the standardization of the Xhosa language. So when I think about church, it's also a political home, because we talk a lot about how we converted Christianity into what they call isingci sobumnyama. So there was a lot in my upbringing around blackness. I used to carry bags to school, and I went to the kinds of schools where you had a school bag with a school logo, but we couldn't afford those. So mine had things like eradicate poverty, equality for all now, with multiple pockets. Fucking loved those things. And so that's what I understood about life, that things feel different depending on how much money you've got and where you live. Through the church, through schooling, through my mother's experience in the unions. She's also a part of the SACP. And some caucuses were held at my house. She's a single parent. So a lot of I'd go to bed at 8, I'd wake up at 11 with a house full of people. I always knew what Congress fever was, because that's when the house was busiest. And so when I got to varsity, the first stalls I went to during all week were SASCO, the youth league, trying to figure out how to lend a hand, go learn some more. And truly also just to think about how my peers in first year were having very different experiences to me as well. We may not all have been able to sign up for the yacht club or something like that, but some of us weren't making it through the computer literacy class or the English literacy class. And so I was thinking a lot about, what do I do to help make sure that our younger siblings are able to have a different experience of school and therefore a different experience of varsity? I think that's what landed me up inside what we call civil society, but the social justice sector as well. I went to school in Cape Town, university. I'm from PE, just by the way, but I went to school in Cape Town at UCT. And so the activism space, the social justice arena, I think in that space is very vibrant.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of work that we were doing with old ANC vets off campus, being connected to community struggles in that way. I met Equal Education quite early in my varsity career. We volunteered at EE. I'd never been in an environment where young teenage folk who are understood to not have much, but could show such agency in taking on government. We weren't coming in to tutor maths. There was a little bit of that too. But we were coming in to help young people understand how we can work towards promulgating a national law for school infrastructure. It just blew my mind. And I never looked back. I've just been interested in this idea of we'll act local, band together, build solidarities, but do systemic work in South Africa. And I think with every other 3 to 5 years in South Africa, tides turn, social conditions get harder. It's difficult to not know what you know and to not do something about it. But it's also such a beautiful people sport. Like, no part of this work is done in singular. So the idea that you're always connecting to someone, to a community, learning about different kinds of issues and impact, the tapestry of social justice in South Africa is, it's warm and it's big, and there's always things to learn and people to meet. And so I do it because I couldn't imagine doing anything else.
Were there any particular lessons that you learned from your mother in activism
Sadly, the first is that patriarchy is a real thing. And it isn't enough to assert your own boundaries as one woman. And so we really should be in the business of figuring out how collectively as women, gender non-conforming people, anyone most marginalized, differently abled folks inside traditional organizing spaces, think about representation and claiming our own rights inside of that justice work. So that was a big thing. I mean, she often says she can't believe I've had this or that experience because it's a couple of years after her time inside of that environment. The second thing is really, it's not even a patience, maybe a humility around people's experience. It's so easy to make big assumptions and go off with popular rhetoric about social issues and justice and what agenda, which priorities. Civil society is known for sometimes picking low-hanging fruits,
Sure.
And those things can be important for reform agendas, but they could also be to the detriment of people finding self-expression in the struggles they choose to take up. And so the humility part, my mom has always been like, to sustain something that you've contributed to, you really have to believe that people can own it. And that's why I believe deeply in the principle of building people's power. It's movement work first, it's internal democratic processes and a praxis first, it's feminist practices first. Marx was right. And I preach that gospel everywhere I go. I think anything that I've been part of in the last 12 years of doing social justice work, proverbially, in the country, I've tried to insist that that's the only way that we could do this work. And it pays off, and not in ways where I feel gratified, but the material change is bound to happen. The ripple effect of the struggle machine is bound to birth things you could have never imagined. And that's what we're in the business of, And the last is to try really to live as you'd like to see the world. That's like a massive concept. And my mom's not perfect. We've got our own things as a mother and daughter.
Sure.
She's a Black woman with many things to grapple with and contend and deal and heal. But maybe it's integrity, rather. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. She really tries to live in integrity and to convince others around her that it's not a massive undertaking. And it's no weakness to be good to people, regardless of what they have or look like. And I feel relief even saying it, because I think if I came to this work differently, I would be stressed all the time.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to own people's struggles. I'd catch me dead. Yeah.
It's a fascinating insight, and we often don't reflect on the things we have learned, whether we have complex relationships or not with those people who are around us. They've somehow shaped us.
Please.
And in your work as the effective or one of the collective of leaders of equal education, what would you say has been one of your biggest challenges and biggest triumphs or successes in this last 7 or so years, I believe?
Yeah. Oof. One of my biggest challenges, okay, I'm going to frame, I don't want it to be too abstract, but I've learned the hard way that organizational culture is extremely fluid, like it's consistent work.
Sure.
And so what you imagine you've done could feel very different in 9 months' time. And so it's no joke when folks say, if you're trying to build an organization with a healthy soul, it has to be inside of everyday praxis, And sometimes I forget that. I get caught up in my own overwhelm or strife because work is hard. And just being a working class Black woman in South Africa has got its own challenges. And we bring all of those things to our work environment all the time. And so you forget, or you're frustrated because the thing that you thought would move isn't, The reform campaign you're working on is taking longer than expected. Or you're dealing with loss and grief, because that's also part of this work. And so you forget that people will always, on a daily basis, actually rely on you to model the kind of culture that should exist in the organization. And so you can't, while vulnerability is key, you can't bring your 12-year-old self to the work environment. That's been a hard lesson because it hits me when least expected.
Yeah, sure.
And I may not always be at my strongest when that happens. And so I then have to go back. And the work is also a mirror. That's the other thing about social justice work and working with a lot of people. I mean, at the moment, we have a staff of 50 plus at EE. When I started, we were 74 staff, young folk.
Right.
And every person, every interaction, all structures, it's all just a mirror on the things that you do well and some maybe not so well.
Yeah.
And you have to learn as you do it and be the so-called leader. It's wild. So maybe that's the biggest challenge. And I will reflect on that for all of my breathing life.
What about the success?
The success, man, I don't know if people know this. We are the biggest and baddest youth social movement, I think, in the world. Okay, we've joined things like global students forums. I don't see young people organize and meet on a weekly basis to build school-based campaigns that inform systemic and structural reforms at province and national level, and do as much political work in reading, in discussion as we do. It's not a mobilized group of folk. It's truly an organized social movement with internal democratic structures that run annual elections for representation. I mean, we've got our own version of shop stewards. The old union style model is how this movement runs. We've got a governance body called the National Council. It's elected every 3 years. It's representative of our structures. It's got learners, post-school youth members, ages 18 to 25, small contingent of parents. And we truly practice these ideals around participatory democracy, equality, justice, inclusivity, intersectionality in the ways that a 10-year-old from Davidton can explain to you. I'm not talking about Crankshaw and those things now. And things about solidarity is a key part of how they do the everyday, you know? This is nothing like it. And so the gains really, I think, is being able to sustain something that was started 16 years ago. I don't even know how many movements can claim a 16-year, but truly legitimate in all of its facets, sort of run for that thing to be alive. I mean, today is the 26th. Tomorrow we've got an action, the 27th of September, outside the Department of Basic Education, because learners came to us and said, okay, now we've got our political parties, we're grappling with the GNU. Can we go talk to the minister and give her our contract for her work over the next 5 years? And that kind of agility in young folks, the fearlessness, the courage, the audacity it's inspiring. And it means that the mechanics internally are working. Young folks across the 5 provinces are feeling alive to then being able to impact and run and lead what they understand would be some kind of realization of democracy or the right to education or the right to political participation. I think
that work of just building that institution and sustaining it. It's major work. It's massive work. And we're in a time in our country where the question of education and policy has risen to the surface once again. The public debate has been focused on the BELA. I never know what to say because BELA already has Act, but then it's like BELA Act. The BELA bill, the BELA Act has been, the talk of the town recently. What is your take on, this important piece of legislation? I see that the EE Law Center, I believe it's called, has taken a nuanced approach to say there's a lot of important stuff here, but we're not just going for these amendments completely. There are also things we need to bear in mind. So help us think through where we should be on these amendments.
Yeah. First, just for context, okay, in 2024 in South Africa, we're causing an entire hoo-ha around this act. And I think for progressive society, it shouldn't be this much of a debacle.
Yeah.
But it is, and we must ask ourselves the questions around why. Okay.
Just right there, you're already starting because, why is everything just a negotiation? And there's a juxtaposition to that, but we'll come back to it because we're negotiating on transformation and redress and equality in the context of
fiscal austerity agenda,
Sure.
and the dwindling access to basic social rights.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's 101 a neoliberal democratic projects. And 30 years into democracy, we truly don't deserve to be here. And I think as ordinary people, we need to expect more from our political leaders. We need to expect more from government and of ourselves and each other. There's a kind of maturity to our democracy that is easily accessible. You know, it wasn't long ago when things felt very differently. And there are enough of us here that are inside of this work, vibrant social justice sector, that can talk to each other from a very sober place around what is just and right. And so maybe we should just do less entertaining of nonsense, regressive, right-wing institutions, because I don't think they deserve that space.
Oh, yes.
And get to work so that we can live well collectively.
Because part of the problem is that it's just you get diverted, right? So now you're having debates and negotiations, and the actual work then gets lost.
Yeah, and it's a distraction.
Yeah.
But I mean, we'll come back to what I mean by that.
Sure.
So the BELA bill, when I think about BELA, I think about the Electoral Act that's been discussed at the moment as well. I think about NHI. All of these things are pushing for some kind of equality. And I think what may be happening is two things. The first is that maybe even the GNU, but our previous government at least, the sixth administration, had lost a huge amount of legitimacy in South African general public and population. And so people don't believe that the administering of laws that push for justice and equality can be properly administered.
So true.
And that's why I think people feel like it's either I divest from social goods and this kind of public law system, but the other side of that coin is that you're protecting then your own privilege. And so we need to think about how we take those people along, but also continue to build state capacity.
Yeah.
I keep saying to folks that I talk to about this, social and traditional media, that part of our work as social justice sector, civil society, the education sector, is to insist on the building of the public sector and building state capacity. An overwhelming amount of children are still in public schools in South Africa. And to try and build a system that protects an elite, but also prioritizes the emergence of a public-private partnership that is not regulated. And we've seen the ills of what happens to charter school models across Africa and different parts of the world. That can't be the alternative to insisting on a better run government and state and education sector.
Yeah, sure.
And a public education sector at that. And that's what BELA is trying to do.
Right.
Okay. I'm saying 5,000 things, but the point is...
No, it's important context. Very important.
The narratives that are distracting us are trying to have us divest in the idea of a capable and working state, a government, and an education system. So the Equal Education Law Center, when we come back here another day, we want to talk about what we call movement building. So we've built this practice of working together with public interest litigation organizations, with these lawyers, taken from the 70s in South Africa. But we share a lot of our resources and views and politics and values. And so we've worked on this BELA work together.
Right.
And so I wouldn't call us holding a nuanced position. I think what we are saying is that the bill and the act is just. It should have been passed.
Sure.
There was an opportunity at some point in the portfolio committee, whilst this bill was being discussed, to strengthen the clauses around language policies and admissions policies. The portfolio committee struggled to take that through, and that's fine. We're at the point now where we've also been advocating for the president to sign this thing into law before the gymnastics of 29th of May, 2024. And that didn't happen, which is fine. And now we're here, okay?
And there were many bills signed into law just before the election. This wasn't one of them. So it sat on the desk for one reason or another.
And I don't think, we must also just say that clearly here, the reason it sat with the president for so long, it might have been a prioritization thing, which I think it is, and we'll come back to that. I am genuinely worried about whether South African government is prioritizing the right to basic education. I think there's a bit of a regress there. And again, that's connected to the neoliberal agenda. If we're going to, okay, we'll come back to that.
Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below.
But it wasn't stuck at the president's desk because of its constitutionality. The reason it's been signed into an act now is because it is sound. And good luck to the right-wingers convincing us otherwise.
Sure. So your fundamental position is this is in the right direction.
Absolutely.
We need this now. Yes, there may be some details, but let's get this thing implemented.
Absolutely. 2 things now I can think of that were jarring for us is the criminalization of parents whose children out of school.
Sure.
That's just blasphemous. It can't be that 30 years into democracy, being the most unequal country in the world,
Yeah, I know.
you think that there's a black parent, because this is typically black and brown parents that will have their children out of school. You think that's by choice. It's
Yeah, absolutely.
it's unlikely.
And then we speak of the system of incarceration already. Like, why would we fill up
Exactly.
these institutions more with like
Parents.
with parents
Struggling
who are committing
parents.
non-violent offenses? Like, it just doesn't make sense.
And so if we were like a progressively social government, we would be thinking about interventions that combine social security clusters that provide support to parents that have children that are out of school, not this nonsense of criminalization. And I understand the law has to sometimes protect those that are most vulnerable. So we're thinking here of conditions where children are being, kept at home for nefarious reasons.
Sure.
I can understand that those conditions do exist.
Yeah.
But in the general, the conditions that parents are contending with are that schools in urban provinces are typically oversubscribed. That's what government calls it.
Right.
There is no more space in the school or classrooms to accommodate your child.
Okay.
Our schools, by the way, overwhelmingly, especially in the urban provinces, are dealing with rampant overcrowding. I've taught for a year as well. The average class I had in Khayelitsha and Cape Town was about 68 learners. And so that's just the reality of things. So they're oversubscribed, they're overcrowded. There is also a situation where, as education budgets are being cut every year, the provincial departments of education are choosing to scale down on the provision of scholar transport. So learners have gone back to walking plus 4 kilometers one way to school. There's period poverty for young folks, a young woman in particular in South Africa. There are issues around the cost of stationery. LTSMs, which we call learning, teaching, support materials, are also the first line items to go
Right.
when budgets are being shaved at a provincial level.
So things like books and things
Books,
like
paper, pens, all the things that you can imagine as part of the stationery outfit. And schools are asking parents to bring a Typex rim per quarter, for example. That's probably almost half of your monthly SRD grant. So those kinds of provisions are difficult because that money is meant to feed your family for a month. The price of uniform, the price of food. The school nutrition program is amazing, and we only wish for it to work well, but it's struggling. It's also getting trimmed as budgets get cut across the board. And so these social wage issues, what we call them, are the things that government is choosing to fiscally consolidate, is what the Department of Basic Education is calling it.
Yeah.
A fiscal consolidation approach. But those are the things that get learners to school, especially those in schools that are ill-resourced.
Sure.
Those are the things that support teaching and learning for both students and teachers. And so there's going to be a likelihood of many more children not being able to be in school for these reasons.
Right. So we should be supporting the safety and welfare net around
Exactly.
learners rather than criminalizing people who don't send their children to school, usually for these social reasons anyway. Makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly. And the other thing about this part, this clause of the law, is that, for the last 15 years, we'd spent a lot of time as the sector. When I say the sector, I'm referring to education folks in civil society, in social justice space. We spent a lot of time trying to help ministers understand that their job isn't about only what happens inside the classroom. The right to education, and many court cases have helped us do this. You give it legs, you bring it to life by ensuring that children can get there and are holistically provided for in that environment. And BELA makes an attempt. It's in initial clauses, but for this part of it, it just strips away that part of it, because that's the part where you imagine the parent is solely responsible for getting this child into the classroom. And that's not fair, not in South Africa's context.
Sure. Sure.
The second part, the second clause here that we were concerned about are the clauses around admissions policies and language policies. And these are the parts around SGB powers. Now, please, anyone watching this, go find us on social media and you'll get a sense of who we are, what our politics are, the ideologies, who are the people we center in the work. Because I would never be caught anywhere arguing for the stripping of powers of school governing bodies.
Sure.
We understood that to be a key part of the democratic agenda from 1990, ensuring that school communities themselves, regardless of where they are, could hold and protect and safeguard and inform the way their schools are run. That's a critical part of democracy for us, not just in the education system, but for South Africa as well. SGB, we do a lot of training with SGBs as well. They're super important to the well-being of schools and children.
Sure.
What we're calling for here, and it isn't strong in the BELA at the moment, and is a point of deep contention. What we're calling here for is an opportunity. This should already be happening, by the way, okay? Through heads of departments at a provincial level in schools, acting through their district offices. It should already be happening that district officials and the HOD are reviewing school admissions and language policies on an annual basis.
Sure.
The problem is that it wasn't clearly legislated. And so what we're saying is that as schools and the system gets overburdened, there is tipping of scales around the function of schools depending on the kind of resources they've got. In the Western Cape, for example, right now, in this financial period, former Model C schools in the leafy suburbs of the Western Cape, are getting more money provisioned to them than schools that are in quintile 3, 2, and 1 of the Western Cape. Now, that doesn't make sense. Because schools that are previously Model Cs, like the ones I went to, you pay school fees. And there are other various ways where you can fundraise. Granted, things are difficult. But in a fiscally constrained environment, we should be making sure to build some kind of equity in the process of distributing funds to schools, as opposed to just ensuring that those that have keep getting more and then can protect the schools by barring access and using things like religion, admissions, and language.
Yeah.
And so while the schools that we work in typically have the numbers that I was talking about earlier, schools that are previously Model C, public schools too, still have about 28 to 35 learners per classroom. So they're holding their teacher-learner ratios nicely. They are not adapting or reconciling themselves with the changing demographic and social construct of the school community. And so can still, in the northern suburbs of Cape Town, only offer Afrikaans as a medium of instruction, even as a subject offering, single medium schools, And that isn't the reality of what South Africa needs right now. An overburdened system needs to share its resources equitably across the board. And we're wanting this act to do that without fear or favor.
So how are the governing bodies then gatekeeping admissions, and why do you think that HODs can rebalance the scales?
Yeah,
because I don't think a lot of people are fully understanding, what governing bodies can do when they go rogue and they create these policies that actually keep people out of the very institutions they need to access.
So there isn't a streamlined national policy for admissions in South Africa. That's the biggest problem. And that means school governing bodies have carte blanche around how they frame the admissions policies. So they'll say, our school is at capacity with 800 learners and will accept nothing more and nothing less.
Sure.
Schools and townships don't have that privilege. The district officials and head of departments can issue more learners than promise them additional classrooms, which sometimes never come. And those are the environments that they learn under. Similarly to language policies, they can choose to not offer isiXhosa or isiZulu, Sepedi, whatever is needed, because the demographic has changed. And so what we're saying is that we need a law that compels the HOD to run those sweeps and reviews through district officials. I know some people have gone, and this is part of the the silly narrative run by those that are contrary to the BELA. Oh, what about the capacity of the HOD? Of course, not one man or person. I'm just thinking about the HODs I know, which are typically men, is only going to be running these sweeps across 500 schools by themselves in a specific district.
Yeah.
Of course not. They've got district officials. The machinery of the Department of Education is quite sophisticated. You can get to all of those schools. And what you do is that you're encouraging school governing bodies to also think about their reviews as ways that transform the schooling environment. Maybe we see less of those Pretoria Girls High cases over the next period, because now we've got something systemic, overall provides an enhancement of support for schools through the HOD just for these admissions and these language policies. It should be encouraged, really, if we're trying to deepen democracy in South Africa.
Yeah. Do you think it goes far enough then in actually solving this problem of using admissions policies to keep the demographics of schools a certain way?
Yeah, it's a pity that this conversation is so linear for us, because I was listening to the minister on Morning Live today, and she was talking about how there isn't any real systemic change that can be made by BELA right now. And I thought, no, but that's not true. I know schools start next year in January, but the preparation for the next academic year has already started. And so what should be happening right now is that schools are starting to plan in accordance to an amended law. And what it does is that it helps with the zoning crisis or question. How far do you have to be away from the school in order to get access to it, especially if you can afford it? It's a school of choice. Please let people come in. If the admissions policies are reviewed by HODs between now and December, and they can pinpoint and go, you need more learners there, you've got space here. The overcrowding, the oversubscription issues of the next academic year can be dealt with literally within the next quarter. And there's a whole sector to help support that kind of agenda. We've got access to many school communities that can help make sure that these things happen. And over the next academic year, you then see how you can creatively also use the conditions of this like austere budgeting crisis inside of the education system. It truly, truly is something that can transform what is a very hard situation in education right now. And the other thing that's important about this, when you've got schools that are less oversubscribed, it means that even learning at foundation phase becomes easier. It's a different ballgame. Because what we're also learning is that foundation phase, and we'll come to the grade R part of the clauses of this law just now. Foundation phase at the moment is sitting on very rocky grounds. So 81% of learners in the 4th grade can't read for meaning. But what we've also learned is that 23% of children that leave grade 1 cannot fully enunciate all the letters of the alphabet. But that's because they're sitting in overcrowded classrooms. That's the first condition. The second is that likelihood is that Black and brown learners are experiencing formal schooling for the first time in grade R. And they haven't had enough experience of the schooling system to get in there and learn these things and catch up and compete at par with their peers that are in different kinds of schools. And so being able to open up admissions and share the spaces that exist in the current education system means that even those learners have a very different start to their academic year. And in the 4th grade, then maybe things could look differently in about the next 3 years. And that's what we're hoping for.
What do you make of the decision to suspend, I think it's the amendments to clauses 4 and 5? Do you see this as a capitulation, or do you think it's a reasonable compromise in the interim?
I have very little patience for politics. I think it's just semantics. The president has signed the act into law because it's constitutionally sound, and those that have other issues with it should take it up at the Constitutional Court, and we'll meet them there. And we should carry on with the business of providing education to children and planning towards it. I know that they came out of those negotiations talking about a technical task team that will deal with the policy differences amongst the parties in the GNU. I mean, even those kinds of things are going to be done by a small group of people in a small room, no real consultation with what's necessary and needed in school communities in South Africa and a range of other places where the policies might be looking different. And so I think we have to try and protect the education system from being at the mercy of the GNU. It does at the moment feel like the education portfolio is part of a bargaining chip of the GNU. And we're being tossed back and forth depending on what the Democratic Alliance sees versus the ANC. And I know they've gotten they've gotten good ground politically at the moment, being able to sway between those that are in opposition and those that are inside the GNU, depending what they need, right? The swing vote for the BELA Act inside Portfolio Committee before NCOP and National Parliament was Ringo Madlingozi from the EFF.
Wow.
Okay, that was, I thought that was quite something.
Yeah.
A comical but inspiring moment.
Exactly.
But then to join the GNU and to consolidate austere budgeting praxis, they're relying on DA ministry to continue sort of that trajectory. Somewhere in between there, we need to be able to take this thing either back to people over the next 3 months, and or have that tactical task team be at the advice of a broader collective of people. But I really think he should have just gone ahead with it. I think this is purely semantics. And the thing is that as the Democratic Alliance, the ACDP, if it still exists, the VF Plus, all of those entities, if they want to still contest this bill, which they likely will, they'll go to court anyways. Solidarity aligned.
Yeah.
And so, I just think we need to start working on this because it is right and sound, especially for this period of South Africa's democratic timeline, lifetime, lifespan,
Span time. No, exactly. Like, I think what you said is quite important, that because we have been failed so many times by this government, maybe in its previous forms, we've started to think that whatever government proposes is just doomed to fail. And then we don't look at things in terms of whether they would actually be a step forward. And so now it feels like people are confused because this BELA thing is in the public domain, and it seems like the criticism has almost gained the mainstream narrative, whereas why this is important is now like not mainstream. You're almost like daring if you say you support the BELA bill. Yeah. Why do you, I guess, and sorry, just to build on this based on what you said as well, like, why do you think this matters so much to those who oppose it?
Like the other things happening at the moment, the Electoral Act, it's introducing a more radical reform agenda. And I think because state capacity is so crippled, people are nervous about completely relying on government to provide the social provisions of their households. And we've created a kind of South Africa where people can opt out. They can have their own solar, they can have their own boreholes, take their children to private education or keep them in public, but in a different echelon of the sector. And we're doing away with those kinds of protections. We're demanding inclusivity in one foul swoop. And I think that's threatening. And the machinery of people that are contrary to this bill, the media machinery, I think is quite sophisticated.
Yeah, absolutely.
We must never take for granted, and this is why I'm so glad we're here. We can never take for granted how much right-wing parties, I wanted to say opposition, but that isn't really what we call opposition anymore in South Africa, but right-wing institutions invest in social, traditional, popular media.
Oh, yeah.
To build angst around things that actually are naturally justice aligned. And
true.
we don't spend enough time, I mean, we don't even have many of these kinds of platforms, right?
Yeah, that's why, I've spent time building this, because you actually realize there's virtually nothing. There's nothing.
That's scary.
Yeah.
And so we do need more of these conversations to open up the minds and the awareness of people around what is actually being proposed here. And also for people to, I can't say this enough, this thing isn't happening to us. It must happen with us. And so as the Act goes into play, in school communities across the country, go and find out how you can support. Go and find out as you're applying for your own children's school, what school of choice means. Talk publicly, reach out to us if you're having trouble with the admission story. If the budget cuts have meant something quite devastating in the school community near you or in your school as a teacher, let's talk about these things so we don't show people the consequences of these things after the fact, which is likely what is going to happen if we don't start participating in this moment.
Yeah.
The minister this morning said, she had a conversation with the country oppressor yesterday about budget cuts.
Yeah, I'm
and she
interested
said,
in your views on that.
And she said, oh, the MECs, they're not saying they're retrenching teachers. They're just saying they're unfilling vacancies. And she understands the consequences of that. That's untrue. There are teachers. We've built a WhatsApp community in the Western Cape after the announcement of 2,700 teachers being retrenched in the next period. There are teachers there who started photographing their letters of retrenchment and uploading them onto the group. And that's the power of participating in something. But they've got skin in the game, right? They're losing their jobs, and so they want to get involved. But we should all be doing this together if we want to continue to build a healthy education system.
It's so fascinating to me because there's all this hype right now around the new coalition government, and I understand people want to feel happy and all of that.
Me too. I want to also.
Don't we all, and we've also all been through so much already, But at the same time as these vibes are building, the actual budgets of so many important services are being cut in front of us. And I wonder if you can expand further on this press conference from the minister.
Yeah.
How it came about, which is also interesting to me, but the effect of just cuts to education in South Africa and the long-term consequences that could have on not just the sector right now, but the country and its future.
I'm going to try to break my thoughts up into three because it's a truly upsetting realization. I don't even know what to call it, a crisis, really. The first thing is that the new minister talks about her role as being devoid of oversight of MECs of education. So the current Minister Severe will say to you, I unfortunately can't hold MECs of education in different provinces accountable. That's the job of the Premier. So my work will be try to build relations with the Premier so that I can access and support the MECs. And I think that's just inappropriate to say. A big part of her role is supporting the provision of education across all provinces. And so she must have direct oversight over those ministers. The reason I'm mentioning this is because when we talk about budget cuts, her next plan now is to consult National Treasury, which is just, but to also consult the MECs of finance in different provinces to try and see where we could find money elsewhere. Now, that's a dangerous mechanism because what's going to end up happening, and the government nationally has started doing this, pegging social rights off against each other. So they'll go, oh, but you're wanting a basic income, but you also still want clinics and a working health system and more money in the education system. All of these things simply aren't possible, while the majority of our GDP now goes to paying off debt. And this is the quintessential story across many African countries, the result of why many young folks in Kenya are now dead or missing. And that kind of wave is growing, right? And it's coming further down south, which I'm quite keen on. Let's see what we can do about that. So that's the one thing, that it feels like there's an evasion of responsibility from National Minister around her ability to find and make sure that she safeguards the pot of money allocated to provincial and national education departments.
Yeah.
The second thing that's happening here is that this is not a new story, right? We've been watching the per learner allocation, the money given to each learner in the education system, decrease in real terms over the last 12 years. And that's why I was saying earlier that it does feel like South African government, particularly during the Zuma and Ramaphosa periods, divest from education as a priority.
Sure.
Now, that is a crisis. No functioning, flourishing, democratic nation can build itself for future generations, even in the current, without democracy as part of national priorities. And so it keeps feeling like we're talking to, what is the term? A wall. I wanted to describe the wall, but I thought it might be rude. And so we're not getting through to anyone. There's less and less political will from presidency, national government, the executive to prioritize education. Should never be that whilst austerity grows in South Africa, the education budgets are the first to go down.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier, there's an inequity around who has enough money. So the rural provinces are experiencing the worst cuts. KZN at the moment has a per learner allocation that's at least 48% of what it was 10 years ago.
Wow.
So schools per child are getting 48% less money than they did 10 years ago. And inflation's grown, all sorts of things have happened. Now that's wild. That's a majority of rural provinces. They've got the most amount of schools, less teachers, infrastructure's awful. And they're vulnerable to so many things, including climate shocks. But that's the scenario that we're sitting in inside education system in ordinary schools in South Africa. The third, the minister is talking to us about offloading some of the responsibilities in the DBE to relevant departments. Here, I'm imagining she's talking about public works to build schools, water and sanitation to make those provisions. And this is what I keep saying when I talk about the business of education isn't only what happens in the classroom. And I think once South Africans and government in particular can get that right in their minds, we'd be building an entirely different education system. And the shared responsibility of that provision would look differently. But we do need the Department of Basic Education to understand that its primary mandate is to fulfill Section 29. And that includes things like building of schools, adequate classrooms, windows, libraries, and school fields, and so forth. And so, yeah, I think those three things I share just to go, it doesn't feel like there is anyone listening to this rationale around the impact and the threats of austerity or cutting budgets in the education system. In fact, what we had suggested to the minister is to maybe focus our energies on recovering the 5.2 billion rand of fruitless expenditure in the last financial period. Stop corruption. Don't cut budgets. The Department of Basic Education, in the last 16 years of EE's existence, has not blacklisted a single implementing agent that is meant to be building schools or contractor. They just haven't done enough to curb corruption. And now the people that must suffer at the bequest of these fiscal consolidation processes are the poorest and most marginalized learners in the country, children. And I wouldn't be sleeping at night if I was in this precarious position. And so yesterday's press was disappointing because the minister told us nothing. And I think part reason she held it is because she's getting mounting pressure from all parts of the sector to do something in response. Because MECs are taking liberties. They're retrenching teachers, making grand announcements of not adding more teachers into the system and or additional classrooms. And there's an overcrowding crisis. That's the minister in Gauteng had made that announcement maybe 2 weeks ago now. And so it feels careless. The one thing we're watching from the Department of Education is that it doesn't seem, and they've talked to us about this process last year around this time. And one of the questions EE had asked in that meeting is, are you doing anything to challenge these decisions from Treasury? There was a very lackadaisical response to that, laissez-faire. And so we want to invite the Minister of Basic Education, we want to invite the MECs of Education, the premiers, to join us in convincing Treasury that budget cuts to the education sector aren't the solution here. And what we can do as society is just help make sure that the procurement systems inside of the school chain work better. And that's the business of building state capacity.
Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it.
Absolutely. Well, there'll be a lot to focus on as we go forward. I think we must just set up a monthly EE.
Yes.
Going forward, what do you think are some of the priorities for the next year or so within the sector, and what can we expect from EE?
We're going to work with the rest of the sector. We're mobilizing friends now to try and work on a formal national admissions policy. I think that's going to be absolutely crucial and may be useful for a conversation when our right-wing friends approach the Constitutional Court. The second thing that's going to be important is to think about the literacy and numeracy levels in South Africa.
Yeah.
A few of us are trying to talk to each other and mobilize ordinary South Africans, the rest of the education sector, around some regulations and the right to literacy, the right to read. So thinking about what are the essential things that are needed to be in any classroom, especially at foundation phase, to create a conducive environment for teaching and learning. So we'll follow that story and we'll keep sharing with folks so you can join and hear what we're thinking. 40% of the teachers in the system right now are going to be retiring in the next 10 years. So the idea that provinces can't take on new teaching staff is absurd. And please join us in advocacy. We're waiting for the unions to get their act together so we can rock and roll. But we need to protect the teaching profession and staff inside of our schools because that's the backbone of the system. Over this next month, 2 months, please, between now and the end of February, Equal Education is running a robust, all systems go, the latest thing you've ever seen, anti-austerity campaign. We have to join us. We can't lose any more money in the sector.
Nice.
And we'll help government find creative ways of finding more, And we're not talking about CSI interventions here. Creative ways for the state to repurpose money from paying off debt and making sure that children are safe and dignified inside schools.
Absolutely. Well, we look forward to that work. Thank you for the great work that you do.
Yes, thank you.
It's important, and we don't often get a chance to thank those in our society who are working for justice, for equity, and for educational rights. So big up to you for all the work you're doing, and all the best in the future.
Bless. I have to do a shout out to Equal Education.
By all means.
And to the equalizers in particular.
Sure.
Yeah, good luck for exams, but let's fuck shit up in the streets in the meanwhile.
I love it. And where can people find you, by the way, if they want to get involved, they want to be part of this growing social movement?
On all social media platforms, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. We've got a WhatsApp channel. Please follow us. DM us. We're so keen for friends. Look, like I was saying, there aren't many youth social movements, never mind in the world, but also in South Africa. In fact, there are 4 social movements left in the country. Another topic for another day. And so these young people really need every single one of you. They need siblings, peers, academics, professionals, not just with fiscal support, which would be very much appreciated. We do have a scan something on the websites. Scan, my friend, and make those monthly contributions and donations
please.
to EE. But come and lend your support. Youth development is a big part of what we do as well. If you know some things you want to share with other young folk, come through. We will vet you, of course. Don't come through with some scaly nonsense. But otherwise, we're building this thing for all of us. So come join us, please.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and we look forward to further conversations.
Hey, bless. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to help get us to 150,000 subscribers, and like, comment, and share this video with everyone you know. Aye.